officially the afternoon, I want to welcome you. It just occurred to me sometime after the last program, we had so much on the agenda and I was going so fast that I didn't introduce myself. So I'm Julie Nix, and I'm current president of the Historical Society. I'm thrilled for you to be here today. We have a little lighter agenda, so I'll be able to not trip on my tongue so much. The first thing we do at the beginning of every meeting is pledge allegiance to the flag. So if you could stand, and Biddy is going to lead us. No, they're pointing at each other. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We're through another election season almost, so it's kind of a relief. When you walked in the door today, you should have been given a copy of the minutes from the last meeting. I hope you've had a chance to look those over. It's another formal part of our agenda. So if you'll take a minute to look at them, I will entertain a motion to approve them.
So moved.
All right.
Second.
Second. Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. For those of you who were at the meeting last month, you will remember that we introduced our slate for this year that was prepared by the nominating committee. We also gave people the opportunity to nominate people from the floor. There were no nominations from the floor. So I am here today to present that slate and also to ask you to approve it. The slate of officers for next year is President Biddy Martin, stand Biddy, Vice President, President-elect Lynn Pitcock, Secretary Elaine Johnston, Treasurer Ray Rossett, and then we will have four new board members. 3 of them are brand new. The continuing board member on the slate is Tom French, so I'll introduce him first. John Purple, Ron Fuller, and Kyle Clem. So I will now entertain a motion to accept the slate of officers for 2023. Second. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, thank you. Now at this point, I usually introduce Liz, our executive director, but she is taking care of some personal business today and taking care of a friend of hers who's had a recent health issue. So now I'm going to put her hat on and give the announcements for today. First of all, there will be no meeting here in December. We'll resume the regular meetings in January. Instead, we'll have our Christmas dinner at the Country Club on Wednesday, December the 14th. This is open to anyone, member, non-member. We'll send an email to members with the details. If you're not a member and would like to join us, just give us a call at the Historical Society and we can give you the details. But it will be on Wednesday, December the 14th. The really good news, which Liz would be dancing across the stage, except there's no stage, is that our annual publication, The Record, is at the printers, and it will be mailed to members the 1st of December, and then for sale at the Garland County Historical Society. So for those of you who have used this as a Christmas gift in the past, it will be available after the 1st of the year at the Historical Society. We had a couple of bumps in the road because of COVID and supply chain issues and this, that, but this year we should be right back on schedule. And one, I have to mention just one little sad note, and some of you may not have known him because we did not have him as a volunteer for that long, but a gentleman by the name of Rick Roberts, who was one of our volunteers, passed away this month. So just want to take a moment to remember Rick. There a short time, but made some very valuable contributions to the society. Okay, now we're at the good part. I get to introduce Hollis Duncan, who is our speaker today. He's a longtime member of the Historical Society. He frequently comes to the archives to research, and that's kind of an accomplishment in and of itself because he has to commute from Washington State, where he resides. So he probably would get the prize for the researcher who comes the farthest. He started his career in broadcasting as a 14-year-old disc jockey. Do you remember that? Okay. And quickly moved into broadcast engineering. He has degrees from Seattle University in electrical engineering, philosophy, and law. I think that's what you call a lifelong learner. He's the former chief engineer at KAAY. Remember that? Yeah, okay. He is a registered electrical engineer in Washington State and the principal engineer at Duncan Engineers in Tacoma, Washington. He's been researching the current Arlington Hotel since 2014 in many locales, including institutions in Arkansas, the National Archives, and the Smithsonian Institution. He will publish a comprehensive history of the hotel in time for its 100th anniversary in 2024. So we'll be really excited about that because that's one of the topics that people come into research all the time at the archives. So anyway, we're really grateful that he again made the trip across the country to talk to us today about radio station KTHS, the Arlington years. I do have to mention one more thing. He kind of had one other aborted trip, but this was, not only was COVID bad enough, but he came and was going to do the program via Zoom, yeah. And we had an ice storm, so it was iced into the Arlington. We did get the program done, but anyway, so I'm telling you, this man is a trooper. So I will introduce Hollis Duncan.
Thank you, President Julie, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so glad you could join us. Good afternoon. And to our viewers in Washington State, good morning. KTHS was at the Arlington Hotel from 1924 to 1928. It came on the air from the Arlington. This is a view of the towers from about 1925. Now, what was KTHS? Why was it important? We now call these AM broadcast stations, and in 1924 and 25, they were just broadcast stations. There was only one sort. KTHS was not the first broadcast station in Arkansas, but it was the most important. In many regards, KTHS introduced, or at least helped introduce, hot springs to the world at large. And we're going to make the case that it was the best broadcast station in the United States for several reasons. That sounds a little ridiculous. Bear with me. Now, first, I'd like to give special thanks to Harold W. Higgins of Little Rock. Harold has been with me on this project since the very start. He has done a great deal of work, and in fact, he's the guy that got this project started. I'll tell you about that in a moment. One of the problems that Harold faced is he was dealing with someone who is an absolute fanatic on the subject of the Arlington Hotel. That would be me. I'm Hollis Duncan from Beaver Springs. That thing that I'm reaching across the display and touching is the first radio transmitter for Radio Zagreb, what is now Croatia, at the Nikola Tesla Museum in Zagreb. It's not similar to the KTHS transmitter, but I liked it anyway. Okay, I've received all sorts of thanks. Rather than doing the thanks at the end, I want to do them at the very start. Lots of people that we cannot cover, but quite a few that we can. First is Mr. Monty Scott. Mr. Scott owned the Arlington Hotel for many years. When we contacted him and asked him if we could go crawling around on the roof of his hotel, he was very receptive, and we appreciated that quite a lot. Thank you, Mr. Scott. We want to thank the staff of the Arlington Hotel, Bob Margarana and Mr. Alan Sims. who have been unfailingly gracious to us and letting us kind of go in the hotel where we wish to go. And also to Miss Gay, Miss Nancy, and Miss Carmen, the three ladies that run the hotel today. We want to thank Mr. Al Rajabi. Mr. Rajabi is doing a wonderful job of rebuilding the Arlington Hotel. He is the current owner. I'm not Mr. Rajabi, but I look forward to it. Now here's a picture of Mr. Martirana, Mr. Rajabi, and Mr. Sims as they turn over the keys to the Arlington Hotel. I want to thank David B. Treadway, former morning man of KTHS, US 97. David gave us encouragement at a very critical time, and we appreciate it a lot. David and I worked together at the original KLAZ in Little Rock, me as engineer and he as the program director. Rest in peace, David. We want to thank Ray Poindexter. He wrote Arkansas Airwaves, and it's a wonderful resource if you want to know about old radio in Arkansas. It is now online and easily accessible. I met Ray when he was writing the book, and he put a lot of effort into it. Thank you, Ray. We want to thank Facebook. There are several really good Hot Springs groups on Facebook. Jerry Merriweather's History of Hot Springs group is wonderful. We have a picture, the only picture we have of the actual antenna at the Arlington was courtesy of Jerry. We have the Hot Springs National Park group, and they have links to other sites for Hot Springs National Park. And of course, the Garland County Historical Society group with Tom Whitlock as the moderator. She puts wonderful pictures up there, and you really should join all of these groups. We thank World Radio History, who has kept every radio magazine known to man and has them available online for free. David wouldn't even take a donation when I tried to send him one. It's truly a labor of love. We want to thank the Sentinel Record and the Hot Springs New Era. We have those on microfilm at the Historical Society, and we couldn't do without them. We found all sorts of information there. We want to thank Ms. Alta Smith. She was the publicity director at the Hot Springs Chamber of Commerce from 1923 to 1963. We'll be talking more about Ms. Alta later. And we want to thank everyone at GCHS. I walked into GCHS in the fall of 2013 thinking I didn't know anyone. What I realized quickly is I was surrounded by friends that I just hadn't met. And we have been welcomed at all points, and we thank you. Now, there are three special people that I'd like to thank that I can't thank in person anymore. One is Gary Jackson, who's president of the Garland County Historical Society. Gary was unfailingly welcome, kind to me, kind to us, and always willing to answer a question. Thank you, Gary. We'd like to thank Wayne Threadgill. I never told Wayne anything on any subject that he didn't know something about, and he always knew many things that I didn't know anything about, and was really generous with his time, with his guidance, with his help, and with his encouragement. Thank you, Wayne. And finally, we come to Nat Harmon. She deserves a program of her own, and I can't give it to her today, but thank you, Nat, you were a friend. And I want to thank Mary Elizabeth Sudar of Tacoma, Washington. Mary has been unfailingly encouraging for this. She was up late last night reviewing the last draft of my program and with some very pertinent suggestions, and she is a member of the Garland County Historical Society. KTHS, the best radio station in the United States. Why was this so? Well, how did it come to Hot Springs? We have a little problem here. John Archibald so kindly gave me permission to take a clip from his Arkansas epidemics of the 1880s that tended to explain things. Unfortunately, the technical gremlins caught up with this today, and it was telling the story of how the telephone came to Hot Springs and how Hot Springs had a telephone 2 years after the telephone was invented. And his conclusion was, whatever the nation had first, Hot Springs had to have right away. And that extended to KTHS. Once radio was developed in the early 1922, Hot Springs got on the program almost immediately and brought a radio station to town. Now, why was KTHS the best radio station in the United States? It had the best people, you'll be meeting some of those, had the best programming, the best talent, the very best equipment, the most expensive equipment by far. But KTHS had a solid reason for being. Many broadcast stations of those days really didn't know why they were on the air. Some of them were associated with colleges, some of them were associated with newspapers. Some of them came and went. A lot of them didn't last. So KTHS had a reason for its existence. It had very strong public support, had reliable financing through the Arlington Hotel Corporation and the Chamber of Commerce. It was located in the very best place on earth.
There you go.
Okay, here's how we got started. The Federal Communications Commission used to keep their records for radio stations on type 3x5 cards. And in the early 2000s, they finally got tired of responding to public records requests for these and put them all online. So one night, Harold and I were looking through these back and forth through email, and we caught this part of the KAAY history card, licensed to the Arlington Hotel Company at Central Avenue and Fountain Streets in the park. And Harold asked the question that got us started on this, that only an engineer would ask: what kind of antenna did KTHS have? It took us 5 years and a trip to the National Archives to find that out. All right, radio didn't exist forever. Before 1985, radio waves were unknown. And a Scottish physicist and professor, James Clerk Maxwell, proposed a system of equations that we still use in electrical engineering today that explained electricity, magnetism, and light. And in his equations, there was the prediction of radio waves. Unfortunately, James Clerk Maxwell died before his theory could be proven. His equations were also hard to understand, but there were several people that tried to explain his things that were called the Maxwellians, and one of them was Oliver Heaviside, which his best friend said he was a first-class kook. He holed himself up in his room at his parents' house for many, many years once he left the telegraphy business and wrote for a magazine, heavy technical articles, and did the electrical engineering world a lot of favors by doing that. But he also made a discovery that was very critical to the operation of KTHS. He discovered the heaviside layers. Now, if we look up during the day, we see a blue layer. And we know that that blue layer disappears at night. And we can see stars beyond it. What we cannot see is a layer that reflects radio waves very well. During the day, the blue layer absorbs those radio waves, and they don't go anywhere else. But at night, the blue layer disappears. The radio waves are reflected off the mirror layer, and they come down in distant locations. And that's what enabled KTHS to reach the nation at night. Now, Maxwell didn't know that whether his waves worked or not, but they were proved in the laboratory by Heinrich Hertz. Hertz proved that the waves were correct, but he didn't know what to do with them. When he was asked what the application was, he said, nothing, I guess. And when he was pressed, he wanted to say, it is of no use whatsoever. This is just an experiment that proves Maestro Maxwell was right. We just have these mysterious electromagnetic waves that we cannot see with the naked eye, but they are there. And we know we're permeated with them at all frequencies every day, and fortunately they're not harmful. In my lifetime, we used to refer to frequency in terms of cycles or kilocycles per second. That was changed to the hertz as the fundamental unit some years ago. Now, by 1990, radio was completely explained mathematically, and we could demonstrate it in the laboratory, but nobody knew what to do with it, and nobody thought much about it because they thought radio waves could propagate across the laboratory, and that was about it. And sure enough, at the frequencies that they were using for their experiments, they couldn't penetrate walls or anything else. So it took a young man from Tuscany to figure it all out. Guglielmo Marconi was a wealthy young man. He was educated by private tutors. He did experiments in his garden with the help of his butler. But his insight was tying one end of the transmitter and one end of the receiver to ground. And he discovered he could talk over the horizon. And that was a major discovery that made young Marconi a whole lot of money. And he essentially controlled wireless telegraphy in the entire world for many years. Okay, so Marconi didn't get anywhere with the Italian authorities, so he went to Great Britain and demonstrated his invention. And he was demonstrated before the British Post Office, and the British Post Office controlled all cable services in the world, essentially, and now would control all, we're in controlling radio. So in 1897, Marconi formed Marconi's Wireless Telegraph Company. He was able to transmit signals across the Atlantic Ocean and then formed the American Marconi Company. And this pretty much created a British monopoly for both cable and wireless communications. Now, Marconi did come to New York to, at the invitation to cover the America's Cup, and Sir Thomas Lipton was the losing yacht. He owned the losing yacht. But Marconi's successful demonstration, and it was successful, was followed by the United Fruit Company, the United States Navy, and by radio amateurs who had formed a new hobby. Now, United Fruit really needed radio because they wanted to have the bananas harvested not too far before the ship came in. They wanted to load them immediately and take off. They also wanted to be able to direct an incoming ship to the port that had the best price for bananas. So the United Fruit Company was a very early operator and had gained a great deal of experience in radio and several critical patents that were necessary for radio. Now we have the United States Navy. The admirals wanted to talk to the ships. The captains didn't want to hear from the Navy because when they sailed off over the horizon, they were the masters of their own ship. And nonetheless, the admirals were in the Navy and they got what they wanted. They began to put Navy ships with wireless sets. Now they were mainly receiving sets. You couldn't put enough power on the ship to talk back. So these messages were going one way for the admirals to the captains, and I'm sure the captains didn't like that either. Now, radio kind of came to a head when the Titanic sunk. Marconi had a wireless station on the Titanic, but it was a private wireless station. The Carpathia also had a Marconi station, but was ordered off the air just before midnight by the Titanic operator because he had important messages to transmit. I'm sure those messages were real important later that same night. So the Carpathia operator went to bed, and the Marconi operator continued to transmit as long as he could. Nonetheless, this disaster got the attention of Congress, and they enacted the Radio Act of 1912, which was the first regulation of radio, wireless or anything else in the United States. And they dumped they designated the Secretary of Commerce as being in charge of this. Now we come to the invention of the vacuum tube. We couldn't do without the vacuum tube, and it was the second most important invention of mankind, or so it's called, second only to the printing press. Now, vacuum tube lets very small signals control very large signals. For instance, it lets a microphone control a radio transmitter. We had no way to do this before the vacuum tube was invented. Now, this is the DeForest vacuum tube. If it looks a little crude, it was. It didn't work very well. It wasn't very reliable, and every tube was different. Nonetheless, it was critical to the issue of radio broadcasting. And DeForest became involved in several promotions of radio and stock scandals. He was not directly involved, but his partners were, and it gave radio an awfully bad reputation that it had a long time, it took a long time for it to live down. However, another company was really interested in the vacuum tube, and that was AT&T, because they had a long distance network that one day the president of AT&T stood up in a meeting and said that it would be extended to the West Coast within a certain amount of time. Well, this was news to the engineers, but they were aware of the vacuum tube. So they acquired the commercial rights to the DeForest tube and turned Bell System Engineering onto it. By the time they got through, the vacuum tube was more or less perfected. And they learned a lot about the vacuum tube that DeForest never knew. Unfortunately, they didn't tell anybody because AT&T was and really still is a very secretive organization. AT&T doesn't exist as such anymore. It didn't publish its results. It didn't sell its vacuum tubes to the public. The things that we know were published long after the fact. And then after World War I, Western Electric began to develop a higher power vacuum tube that we used at KTHS. There was also the hobby of amateur wireless. These folks were both listeners and transmitters, and joined a group called the American Radio Relay League, which was formed in 1915. And the amateurs became very important later when the Navy tried to take over the control of radio. All right, now, radio became important in World War I. Before that, ships had no real way to communicate with each other. The admirals could communicate with the ships using a very large broadcasting station called NAA in Annapolis, Virginia. They used so much, Annapolis, Maryland, pardon me, they used so much power that they went around the world 3 times, but it did the trick. Nonetheless, in 1913, Woodrow Wilson was elected president, or he became president then, and he appointed Josephus Daniels of South Carolina to be his Secretary of the Navy. Well, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy mainly had to deal with an isolationist Congress. So he had an Assistant Navy Secretary who he appointed to deal with the Navy itself. And here's the Assistant Secretary there on the right and or the Secretary on the right and his assistant on the left. Here's a little better picture of him. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, this was 4 years before he had polio, and I think 6 years after he married Eleanor, was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He actively sought this job because he was following in the footsteps of his cousin Theodore, who had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy and then Governor of New York, which is exactly what path that Franklin followed. Now, Franklin saw that World War II was coming, and he could see that radio was going to be important. He also had the wonderful tendency to issue orders in the name of the Secretary of the Navy when the Secretary of the Navy was out of town. So while he was out of town this time, there were 4 or more patents that were really crucial to the Navy war effort. And when they were out of town, Secretary Roosevelt, Assistant Secretary Roosevelt, issued what is called the Farragut Order, which was interpreted to for all these companies to put their patents together and to cooperate. He did not have the authority to do this, by the way, but he did it anyway. And as it turns out, it worked okay. Now, when the United States entered World War I, the government ordered all amateur stations to be dismantled and prohibited transmitting or receiving radio signals. They also confiscated all of the American Marconi wireless stations and turned them over to the Navy. Meanwhile, Westinghouse and General Electric designed and manufactured radio sets, both transmitters and receivers, for the United States Navy. These were installed on ships and were of a great use during the war. Now, these were all, of course, telegraph stations. Now, after the war was over, the government did not want to give American Marconi stations back to the British monopoly. So they formed the Radio Corporation of America, and it was later known as RCA. Westinghouse, United Fruit, AT&T, and Westinghouse were all shareholders in RCA, but it was actually run by General Electric. But the Radio Corporation was strictly transmitting messages. They weren't transmitting entertainment. This was long, long before the NBC radio network or anything else. And they also formed a patent pool to share their patents, and we'll get to one of the consequences of that in a moment. Now, the amateurs were able to come back on the air after the wartime restrictions were started, and these amateurs tended to broadcast. They would play music, they would entertain their friends, whatever, and as it said in the September 1920 QST magazine, it was a rare evening that the human voice and strains of music did not come in over the air. There were also a great number of radio magazines, some before the war, many after the war, and these introduced radio and explained radio and had plans for construction. They sold parts. Finally, the Navy released a bunch of unused Western Electric vacuum tubes and some radio parts, and these were sold through the radio magazines, and this was really quite a hobby. Now, here's an example of some of the radio magazines that were available. World Radio History you can spend, and I have spent hours and hours and hours looking at these. They're also very good for the radio news of the day. Many articles on KTHS, both before and after it came on the air. Well, at the end of World War II, the Navy had radio and they wanted to keep it. And that caused some tension in Congress because the amateurs were fighting to take over as well. Now, there were no broadcasters at this point, so this kind of was fought out. Now, the Navy used very, very long waves to communicate because they tended to cover the earth a lot more. It also took a great deal more power. And there were some higher frequencies that they didn't use and they didn't want. So they gave those useless wavelengths to the hams, to the amateurs, they were called then. And now that is what we know as the standard broadcast band. Now, in 1920, President Harding appointed Herbert Hoover to become Secretary of Commerce. He had been director of the war relief effort just after World War I, and then President Truman appointed him to the same position after World War II. He had quite a good reputation and was quite well admired, and he continued to serve as the Secretary of Commerce under President Calvin Coolidge. But 2 years into his term, here came radio broadcasting. It got dumped into his lap, and he didn't have any instructions for Congress as to what to do. He kept asking, but Congress didn't know what to do either. This was a new technology and no one knew how to regulate it. Here's Herbert Hoover as the Secretary of Commerce, listening to a 1-2 radio of sorts. Now, the very first broadcast station was started at 8XK in Pittsburgh. Frank Conrad was a radio amateur and he worked as an engineer at Westinghouse. He was a self-taught man. He built radio amateur station 8XK on top floor of his garage, and he and his sons played music and live entertainment 2 nights a week. And he developed a following, and the department store, Joseph Ford Department Store, picked up on this and somehow found a radio receiver that they could advertise to receive 8XK. And this was the spark that led to the first broadcast station in the United States. This is a view of 8XK. I've worked at radio stations that were wired worse than that. Westinghouse Vice President H.G. Davis opened his newspaper and said, well, now, I've got an idea here. Because Westinghouse had made radios for the U.S. Navy. They had all the tooling, they had all the expertise, they just didn't have a demand for it, and it kind of let the line lapse. But they could start it up very easily. And Davis saw that at Westinghouse, if it had free broadcast stations, they could sell radio receivers to the public. Now, this is kind of an innovation because no one knew how to finance radio. We could have gone with the German system where the government financed radio. We could go with the British system where you had to subscribe and pay dues for your radio receiver, or you could sell advertising. And that really hadn't been figured out yet. But Westinghouse nonetheless got involved in radio at that point. But the vision, commitment, the financial stability, and the clout to propel radio broadcasting into the national consciousness. KDKA Pittsburgh. Westinghouse asked Frank Conrad to build a radio station at the manufacturing plant in East Pittsburgh, and they were granted the call letters KDKA. They broadcast the presidential election returns in 1920, and the first broadcast was a huge success, and KDKA soon began regular programming. KDKA could have been received in Hot Springs. In fact, you can receive it tonight if you want to tune 1020 on your dial. It's still there. But 100 years ago, there was a single frequency, and everyone was on that frequency. Now, this is quite as confusing as it seems because a lot of these stations didn't broadcast for a couple of hours 2 or 3 times a week. And in a city like Chicago, they had to come to some kind of agreement as to who was going to broadcast when. But when KDKA applied when Westinghouse applied for KDKA and was granted what was then called 360 meters, approximately 833.3 kilohertz, they thought they wouldn't be the only ones on that channel. Well, Hoover wasn't going to create a monopoly, so he proceeded to assign 360 meters to any broadcaster who applied. Well, there was a lot of chaos on the air then. Radio stations today stay very, very, very close to their frequency. In those days, they didn't at all. So there was a spread of stations up and down between 833 kilohertz, but those that got close together would produce a whistle. It was called a heterodyne. Made listening very difficult. Plus, the radios at the time were awfully hard to tune, and we'll see that in a minute. Okay, so Hoover came along and added a second frequency for news and crop reports and weather reports and things like that. I really don't think news was part of it. This made it worse, actually, because the 360 meter stations tended to be spread out, and you could tune an individual station. The 485 meter stations were much better technically, and they didn't spread out. So there was a lot of stations on the same frequency, and that is how the problem of skywave came up. Talk back to the heaviside layer. This is how it was more or less discovered, because even your distant stations coming in on top of your local station. But this still didn't solve the problem. More wavelengths were needed. Now, by the end of 1921, 29 broadcast stations had been licensed by the Department of Commerce, all of the same frequency. At least 20 of those could possibly have been received in Hot Springs. In January 1922, broadcast amateurs were prohibited from transmitting broadcast programming, music, or anything like that. Go back to that slide. And in early 1922, the broadcasting bandwagon gained momentum, and we can see from the newspapers that Hot Springs was right in the mix. But still, there weren't enough radio channels for everyone who wanted to build a broadcast station. So, absent help from Congress, Secretary Hoover called the first radio conference to address the chaos that had been created. This conference lasted for a couple of months and was dominated by the big broadcasters at the time, which were mainly General Electric and Westinghouse. So the result of this conference was to have a third frequency that really didn't help very much. Well, another thing that happened in 1923 is the Department of Commerce began to assign frequencies to broadcast stations instead of wavelengths. Wavelengths made sense if you were trying to calculate the length of an antenna, but not much sense to anyone else. Now, Westinghouse constructed a small chain of broadcast stations, WBZ in East Springfield, Massachusetts, now in Boston, WJZ in Newark, New Jersey, which is now WABC, and KYW in Chicago, which is now in Philadelphia. KYW indirectly started a radio boom across the Midwest that was undoubtedly noticed in Hot Springs. Samuel Insull ran the Chicago Edison Electric Company, and he was a huge opera fan. He learned that Westinghouse was planning to build a broadcast station in Chicago and proposed a joint venture that would broadcast the Chicago Civic Opera. Westinghouse installed KYW at the Edison Electric plant in Chicago, and starting in November 1922, KYW broadcast several opera performances a day. This led to an opera craze. The high society folks in Chicago wanted to hear the opera. And all of a sudden, there was a market for radio receivers. A lot of folks went into the radio receiver business. Some of them weren't very good, some of them were. But this nonetheless kind of lit the fuse for a radio craze throughout the Midwest and would have been noticed in Hot Springs. In early 1923, it became obvious that an overhaul of broadcasting was needed. So Hoover called the second radio conference, and in this case, they created 18 new broadcast channels from 550 kilohertz, which is the normal bottom of our broadcast band, to 1,350, and required all stations to vacate the 360 meter frequency. He also created two classes of broadcast stations, and this is rather important. Class A stations were the smaller stations, and they were assigned to the higher frequencies. Class B stations were larger stations, like the Westinghouse stations. They were assigned to the lower frequency where the coverage was better. They were held to higher technical standards. They were not allowed to broadcast recorded music, and they were inspected a lot more often than the small stations. And KTHS was a Class B station, so this opened the door for a large radio station in Hot Springs. Now, let's turn to radio receiving sets. Who was listening out there, and what did they have? We see pictures of boys with their crystal radios. Quaker Oats would sell parts that you could wind your crystal radio using a coil around a Quaker Oats tin. But those were only good within about 25 miles of the station. They weren't good for listening to a distant station in Hot Springs. But the best receiving sets use vacuum tubes. They had between 3 and 5 knobs. They required large, expensive, and smelly batteries that needed recharging. You had to take your battery down to the auto shop to get it charged up so you could listen again. They required a long wire antenna, like from the house to the barn. They usually required headphones, although speakers were available, and it required careful skill in tuning to receive anything. This is one radio. If you were to look closely at the dials, you see that they're calibrated between 0 and 100. And it was a matter of adjusting those dials until you got the radio station that you wished to listen to, and then you had to write down the number so you could listen to it again. Here's another one. This was the three dial one. The other one was a 4 dial. The 3 dial ones were better, but the public perception was the more dials, the better. There were actually some 5 dial radios that served very well, or that sold very well. You can see the writing area up there, and that is where you wrote down the settings for your radio station so you can get there again. Okay, radio came to Arkansas. At WOK in Pine Bluff, Harvey Couch was founder of Arkansas Light and Power, as it was called then. And he was a very good customer of Westinghouse and saw the operation at KDK in its very early days during a trip to Pittsburgh. Now, Westinghouse began to manufacture radio receivers in 1922 when they began to. The first 300 off the line were given to Westinghouse employees and good customers. And Harvey was one of those good customers, so he received one of the 300 Westinghouse receivers. He installed this receiver in his living room in Pine Bluff and found he could receive KDK in Pittsburgh during the evening hours. Okay, here's a picture from a magazine that lasted only a year and that we only found at the New York Public Library Business and Industry branch. That is Mr. Couch's mother, his son. The little girl in his lap is Catherine, for whom Lake Catherine was named, Mr. Couch, and that's Mr. Couch's sister-in-law. Now, you notice Mrs. Couch is missing, and the chances are that she would not have allowed that radio in her living room because it used these horrible, smelling, noxious batteries that would eat holes in her carpet. Nonetheless, and also the young man, and I forget what his name was, admitted later that this picture was fake because it was daytime and you couldn't get KTHS during the day, certainly not in Pine Bluff. Nonetheless, this is the radio that they had for Harvey Couch. This is very similar to the radios that they had on the U.S. Navy ships. It was only $145, so let's get 3 or 4. So it was $2,500 now. This radio had a speaker, and so did Mr. Couch's, and that speaker was designed by Dr. Frank Conrad, as he was later by Frank Conrad, using an automobile horn. I'd love to know that this radio is still in the APNL archive somewhere, or Entergy as it is now, but I doubt that it is. Okay, so WOK went on the air in February of 1922. You can see Mr. Couch's radios over here to the side. And although the call letters were assigned in order, WOK, they decided stood for Workers of Kilowatts. And it was completely subsidized by Arkansas Light and Power, and it was heavily, and the power company, of course, was heavily promoted on WOK. They broadcast concert music every evening from an orchestra in Pine Bluff. And during 1922 and 1923, WOK broadcast evening concerts, musical programs, market reports, religious services, sports reports, educational programs, and all sorts of things. But they weren't drawing people to Arkansas or resulting in more money to Arkansas Light and Power as the stockholders wished. So they prevailed on Mr. Couch to cease operations of WOK, and its broadcast ended in June 1923. He gave the equipment to Henderson Brown College, where he was a trustee, and it appears that it never returned on the air. I contacted the reference library at Henderson State University and asked them some questions, and they wanted to know what I knew about it, which was, I did find an article talking about all, in the student newspaper, talking about all the glorious things that we're going to do with this radio station, but they probably found, like everyone else found, that they were awfully expensive to operate and very persnickety. Radio comes to Hot Springs. Here we go. And one of my favorite characters of this entire thing is Roy Disharoon. Roy was a young man, born in 1901. He enlisted in the Army in 1918 when he was 17, but he was discovered very quickly and was discharged by July of 1918. I have a copy of his discharge records. He returned to Hot Springs and became he was a licensed radio operator and authorized to operate with 50 watts, which was quite a bit of power in those days. And on November the 4th of 1921, Roy reported that he received the first wireless message ever received in Hot Springs from another amateur announcing the opening of the Houston Fair and Exposition. Roy joined the radio department at Hot Springs Battery Company, and he offered radio repair services. He advertised that he was the only government licensed operator in Hot Springs, that he had 10 years of practical experience. As best I can figure, that means he started studying at age 9, which is entirely possible. I hope to prove that Roy took training in the Navy, but he wasn't there that long. Nonetheless, Roy would build a radio receiver, and in these days they were built, they were not purchased, they were assembled from parts. A fairly sophisticated thing for only $195, $3,400 today. And less expensive radio receivers starting at $25, $430 today. Okay, in August of 1922, Roy went to the Hot Springs Mountain Tower and set up his equipment, and the broadcast featured a program by Dr. Claude Kelly, who told listeners of the many reasons that they should visit Hot Springs. Receiving sets were installed at the Rush Brothers store at the Moody Hotel, and postcards were received from Massachusetts, North Dakota, Wyoming, Oregon, and Ontario, Canada. The USS Shenandoah was in transit from Fort Worth to the East Coast. They knew it was coming, so as it pulled into view late in the afternoon, Roy sent a message to the Shenandoah on behalf of Harry A. Jones, who was mayor of Hot Springs at the time. And he continued to communicate with the Shenandoah until it was over the horizon, headed northeast. And Roy was involved in everything. He opened the radio shop by 1925 at 141 Central Avenue. He offered expert service day or night. repairing, troubleshooting, and rewiring of all types of sets with all work guaranteed. I was never that confident, certainly not at his age. Okay, we have 2 or 3 other folks that we need to talk about who were instrumental in bringing radio to Hot Springs. Ed Appler was one. He owned Appler Electric at Como Square, and he was an early promoter of Hot Springs. He was a member of the Hot Springs Businessmen's League and the Hot Springs Rotary Club. And the Rush brothers were electrical dealers and contracted at 911 913 Central Avenue. They also sold radio receivers. So in October of 1922, Ed Appler brought himself a new loudspeaker, and he and the Rush brothers set up a system that offered radio concerts to the neighborhood. These concerts were heard as far away as Hickory Street. I haven't plotted how far that was, but I'm sure it was quite the thing. There was also Milton Nobles, who ran the Western Union office in Hot Springs, which I believe was located at the second Arlington Hotel. He was also a member of the Businessmen's League and the Rotary Club. And the Rotary Club was an early promoter of bringing the station to Hot Springs. He and Ed Appler worked together to bring the station into existence. That was Miss Alta Smith in 1923. She had been running the Business Professional Women's Library here in several locations, which we're standing in its successor organization right now. But the Businessmen Association was changed to become the Hot Springs Chamber of Commerce, and they hired Miss Alta as its publicity director. You'll find me right in the middle of things, working and very much concerned to ensure success for all. Of course, goodwill and prestige and all that sort of thing count, but I want to be able to check actual results. And Miss Alta was very instrumental in bringing Hot Springs to through the sheer dint of her effort, to the attention of the United States. Then we come to the Hot Springs Junior Chamber of Commerce. Now, there is a Hot Springs Junior Chamber of Commerce today. This is not the same organization. They have their own illustrious history, but they weren't formed until the 1930s. This was an early Chamber of Commerce that was established for the sole purpose of bringing a broadcast station to Hot Springs. Mrs. Hiram McCafferty was the president, and Mrs. McCafferty was very active in KTHS. She performed, and we'll see more of her in a bit. But they estimated that it would take $15,000, or $260,000 today, to build a broadcast station in Hot Springs. Now, at that time, the thought was that the station would be owned by the city of Hot Springs. The Arlington Hotel was not in the mix, as far as we know. Now, WMC in Memphis was an early station that came on the air in 1923, and L.D. Sims, famous broadcaster from WMC, was invited to speak to the Hot Springs Chamber of Commerce. He encouraged the chamber to build a broadcast station and to take advantage of the talent that was regularly visiting Hot Springs. And we had the Hot Springs Night on WMC, December 2nd, 1923. Miss Alta Smith sent letters to chambers of commerce across the nation, sort of thing that she did. The Rush brothers set up a receiving set and a loudspeaker, and Ed set up a receiving set at Appler Electric. And the Sentinel Record has a list of folks who were listeners: the Rush brothers, Ed Appler, the chamber president W.C. Green, W.C. Bruce, C.C. Sparks, Roy Disharoon, C.W. Lester, Sergeant Niles, Bert Hall, and W.W. Ernie. Now, WBAP in Fort Worth was a very huge influence on the establishment of KTHS, both by example and by providing some personnel that I'm sure WBAP did not wish to lose. Nonetheless, WBAP was started by a fellow named Giles Carter. When Giles was 18 years old, when he was 8 years old, his family moved to Bowie, Texas, and he and a group of kids sold chicken sandwiches to passengers when the train stopped in Bowie. And these were free-range chickens that existed in that part of Texas, and were presumably tasty, or at least they were on the train before they realized that they weren't. But Giles Carter was quite the salesman, and by 1905 he becomes sales manager at the failing Fort Worth Star. Well, instead of failing with the Star, he got the money together to buy the much larger Fort Worth Telegram, and he merged them and created the Fort Worth Star Telegram, which still exists today. And then Giles adopted his middle name and became Amon Carter. He's now a famous museum in Fort Worth, and he coined the phrase "Fort Worth is where the West begins." By 1922, the Star Telegram was the largest newspaper in the South and delivered to the Texas Panhandle by stagecoach. They said that Amon Carter would do anything for the betterment of Fort Worth, and preferably to the disadvantage of Dallas. When he took the streetcar to Dallas, he would pack his own lunch so he didn't have to spend any money there. Now, in 1923, Amon Carter heard about radio. So he went to his circulation manager and asked him to look into it. And he went to an electrical store to buy a radio and asked how far he wanted to listen. Harold Hoff replied, "Man, I don't want to listen. I want to talk." After learning the difference between listening and talking on the radio, Harold traveled to Dallas, where he met W.E. Bill Branch, who had built a 5-watt transmitter on his kitchen table. Mr. Branch packed up his transmitter in an orange green and took it to the Star Telegram. And after they received a report from 40 miles away in Mineral Wells, Amon Carter authorized the construction of a radio station. In 1922, WBAP started with 20 watts, and in September 22, increased to 500 watts, and was a very similar, with a very similar setup to what was at KTHS. Now, Mr. Branch was a legendary engineer. After he left WBAP, he moved to the border and built what were called the border blasters. He worked for Dr. Brinkley. He worked for the outfit out of Muscatine, Iowa. He built huge stations and ended up owning XCLO in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, across the river from El Paso, where one day he fell into the high voltage cage and passed away. Now, somebody needed to run WBAP, and Amon Carter couldn't find anyone in the newsroom to do it. So he turned to his most junior guy, a Fort Worth native named Given Campbell Arnew, and said, "You're it." So he became the program director at WBAP. And in those days, announcers were known by their initials. He was GCA. He also wrote a column in the Star Telegram. So WBAP came on the air. By early 1923, Cam Arnew was a recognized expert in the field. He published an article in February 1923. We have a copy of this article in Editor and Publisher magazine, which still exists, and it's titled "Radio Broadcasting, Is It Worthwhile?" He revealed that the minimum investment for a broadcast station was $25,000 for the facilities, $435,000 a day, and $500 for the weekly cost of operating, $8,700 a day. And in his article, he gave his philosophy of radio programming. He liked instrumental music, said popular music was necessary. Piano solo and soprano solo enjoyed the lowest popularity, and the feminine voices do not interest the listeners. The novelty programs drew the most applause, and we saw the novelty programs on KTHS when he became the program director. Because I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Radio also was popular at Hot Springs High School. There was a radio club, and this is from the yearbook, I believe 1925. And one particular name here to draw is the Vice President, Cecil Suit. They misspelled his name. He had 2 T's at the end of his name. Mr. Suit became chief engineer of KTHS. When it moved to Little Rock, he also built KTHV Channel 11. And I knew him, and he was a very, very nice man. So WBA, the Junior Chamber of Commerce arranged for WBAP to do a remote broadcast from Hot Springs High School. This was the longest remote that was ever attempted and probably the most expensive. It was presented on March 18th from 1924 from 9:30 p.m. until 11:45 p.m. And it cost $1,575 for the AT&T lines to broadcast it, $27,500 today. Quite the investment, I would say. But these are some publicity photos this is from the Fort Worth Star Telegram. Here's a list of some of the folks that appeared on the, and you notice the sextet is organized by Mrs. Hiram McCaffrey. She was right there in the middle of it. Here are 2 more, a whistling solo and a violinist and pianist. Rotary Club Boys Band. Now, solos by Mr. W.C. Brown, Dr. O.H. King, and William Rockefeller. And in the later days of KTHS at the Arlington, those men were mainstays. And in fact, the other day, Toma posted a picture, and I don't remember what it was. And down in the comments, it was mentioned that they heard Mr. W.C. Brown sing, and he had a beautiful baritone voice. But Mr. Brown was quite influential. He was a pillar in the Presbyterian Church. But they all performed on KTHS and on the Hot Springs High School broadcast. And here's the violinist who was visiting her aunt, Mrs. H.C. Jennings. This is Natalie Brigham from Wisconsin. And Ms. Brigham, she received violin training at the Marquette University School of Town, and she attracted the attention of Cam Arnew. But in his Star Telegram, Cam Arnoux said, Hot Springs en masse has developed radio mania as a result of this concert. Hundreds of people attended the broadcast and hundreds more listened to the broadcast on receiving such in and around Hot Springs. Chamber of Commerce received more than 150 telegrams from almost every state in the area and a number of long-distance telephone calls from as far away as Denver. Now, there was three people who were watching this very closely, we suspect, and these were the men that ran the Arlington Hotel. Daniel Fellows Gaines was the president. He went by the name Fellows to differentiate himself from his cousin, Daniel Fellows Platt, who at the time was building the Platt bathhouse, which became the Quapaw. He was the owner of it and had inherited it from his father. His uncle was Lyman T. Hay, who was the second manager of the Arlington Hotel after Samuel Stitt, and had moved to St. Louis to run hotels, to buy a hotel and run three others during the the Louisiana Pacific Exposition in St. Louis of 1904. And he stayed there, but he still oversaw operations in Hot Springs with W.E. Chester, the man on the ground. Mr. Chester, I think, was the third manager of the Arlington Hotel, and he was there for a very long time. Mr. Chester was from Canada, but grew up in the hotel business in Hot Springs. He started out as a clerk at the Eastman Hotel, and before too long, he was managing both of them. Now, the situation became a little more focused on April 5th, 1923, when the second Arlington Hotel, which was what is now Arlington Park across from the current Arlington, was destroyed by fire. Almost immediately, they had owned the property across the street since 1900. So almost immediately, they broke ground on the new Arlington Hotel. And we'll see some pictures of it going up. There's a picture just almost a year after the first Arlington burned, or the second Arlington. There's another one coming up. And by the first anniversary, they were up to the fourth floor. Now, following the WBAP broadcast, the Arlington Hotel made the decision to build a broadcast station. Mr. Chester announced the decision on June the 10th, 1924. And in July 1924, he signed a contract with Western Electric to supply the transmitting equipment. Now, Western Electric was really the only place to buy a transmitter, because in the patent pool that they had formed between General Electric, Westinghouse, and United Fruit and the others, AT&T gained the exclusive right to make radio transmitters. At the time, nobody else really wanted to do that, so that was fine. But if you bought the Western Electric transmitter, you also got access to Western Electric programming rights, so you could broadcast from other operations. And KTHS made great use of this during their broadcast time. But another disadvantage was Western Electric asserted the sole right to sell radio advertising. So if you were at a Western Electric station, you could not sell advertising. Also, as a Class B station, KTHS could not have played recorded music. But they did have access to the Bell system circuits to carry remotes from remote locations all around Hot Springs, and we'll talk about a few of those here in a moment. As you can see, by July, the towers had started. By August, the towers were going up. And in October, Cam Arnoux was hired from WBAP to become the program director and chief announcer for KTHS. They also brought Ed Olds with him, and Ed was an experienced engineer. He worked with Mr. Branch at WBAP, was his assistant. He was also an announcer with the initials ELO. He was a Navy veteran with post-war service in the Merchant Marines and was very knowledgeable about radio equipment. And they arrived in Hot Springs on October 16th, 1924. Now, November 20th, we can see the Arlington is essentially complete, and this is around the time that they started turning over floors of the hotel to the ownership to finish out for an opening in December. The sign up there in the middle is Alt and Burton Construction Company, and they're still around, albeit with a different name in Little Rock. The building of the Arlington Hotel was the largest construction bond that was ever made in Arkansas, $3 million, I believe. And they had sent the plans to numerous firms who wouldn't touch it in terms of building. They just they couldn't do it, they couldn't do it, they couldn't do it. Keep in mind, in those days, all the materials for the Arlington had to come in on the train. There was a road to Hot Springs, or to Little Rock, but it kind of existed in theory more than in practice. So all of the materials came in. They had to ship a steam shovel in to dig the foundation and so on. But nonetheless, Alton Burton pulled it off. Now, we have two mysteries concerning KTHS. One was there was a tremendous demand for Western electric transmitters in 1924, but somehow KTHS jumped to the front of the line. Also, at that time, the Department of Commerce was assigning call letters in the KF and WF. But KTHS skipped out and got their own call letters, which were tons of Hot Springs. They were issued completely out of sequence. But we suspect the influence of Senator Joe Robinson, who was a huge supporter of Hot Springs, who deserves a book of his very own. We suspect he had fingerprints on it, as well as likely your local congressman. I don't know his name. But the Chamber of Commerce asked for suggestions for these call letters for the Arlington station, and here is a selection. Unfortunately, by then, the Department of Commerce was no longer granting 3-letter calls, so most of these were cute, but none of any particular use. But nonetheless, it shows the level of civic involvement in KTHS. On November 3rd, the construction permit was issued. The Thomas Pigeon Steel Company of Memphis, they built the Highway 70 bridge between West Memphis and Memphis, the one that just had problems several years ago. But nonetheless, that was their construction. They built bridges all over the Mid-South. And they delivered these 2 steel towers to the Arlington that were installed on November the 10th, 1924. Now, the rear tower was 125 feet tall and the front tower was 103 feet tall, and you will not hear that anywhere else, because any book that you read, any article that you read, except the one that we read, says that the towers were 125 feet tall and 150 feet tall. Well, we got the dimensions of the KTHS antenna from the National Archives, and we realized that they had somehow, if that math was correct, they fit 10 stories of hotel into 85 feet. And although George Mann and Eugene Stern were wonderful architects, I don't think they did that. But once again, the Sentinel record came through, and in the article about the towers, they said the towers were 125 feet tall, the rear tower, the front was 103 feet, and the mathematics fits perfectly. So we're grateful to the Sentinel record for that, or we wouldn't have figured it out yet. So Western Electric engineer Donald H.C. O'Neill, another famous guy, came in to install the transmitter. It's virtually identical to WBAP, so Ed Oles was able to assist him. The transmitter was installed in the west tower on the 12th floor of the Arlington Hotel. Now, that was the announce booth. There was also a studio down on the ballroom level with a piano and a few things, and they had microphones all over the place, or lines extended. And we have yet to locate the transmitter location on the 11th floor, but we think we're on the track of it. So the studios were right there in a room that's about 20 by 20. And you can see it'll be better in this. And I've been in that room. Now that they have remodeled or reinforced the towers, it's full of steel beams, but it used to be just an empty space. And in fact, I was talking to a gentleman this evening who said that he remembers when the curtains were hanging in there from the announce booth back some years ago. This is the Western Electric transmitter. It was one of a kind. It was the best. It was expensive. We used a motor generator to run it and batteries to run the audio equipment. And this is a view of the KTHS transmitter room on the 11th floor. Now, the thing that made KTHS work, that made the transmitter work, was this back-end tube. It's the Western Electric 250-watt tube, and KTHS had 4 of them to make 500 watts of power and 500 watts of audio power to modulate it. This was the antenna. The 2 towers just held the antenna up. And the antenna was a wire line like that. Now, courtesy of Jerry Merriweather at the History of Hot Springs Space Group, this is the only photo that we have that shows the KTHS antenna. We have lots of them showing, several of them showing the towers, but not a lot that show the antenna. So we're very grateful to Jerry for that. You also notice that the Arlington's a little smaller than it used to be, in that this wing was extended. I learned tonight in the 30s. So KTHS is on the air. December 11, 1924 at noon, they conducted their first test broadcast. And here are the first 2 folks that acknowledged. The second test broadcast was intended to check the skywave signal. So they came on at midnight, Friday, December the 11th, 1924. Cam Ardu was the announcer, Ed Oles was the engineer. Natalie Brigham was the violin soloist, and Arthur Platts was the piano soloist. Arthur was very active in KTHS. And Cam offered a $5 gold piece and was won by listeners in Cleveland and Omaha. Okay, that second test broadcast results exceeded the staff's wildest dreams. 25 states, 125 American cities, Canada, and Mexico. Miss Alta came back and sent letters to the Chambers of Commerce, from the Chamber of Commerce to 1,500 newspapers across the country. Cam Arnoux spoke to the Little Rock Radio Club on December 15th, and on December 18th appeared on WFAA in Dallas, owned by the Dallas News. Then we conducted a third test broadcast at midnight on Saturday, December the 13th, which was heard in 22 states. And by Saturday, December the 20th, 1924, everything was ready to go. Now, KTHS during the day had a coverage pattern about like this. You could hear it in most of Arkansas if you tuned in. This is where it was particularly strong in the middle and probably receivable on the outskirts. It started its daytime schedule by broadcasting the services of the First Presbyterian Church. Then they broadcast the next Sunday, the Central Methodist Church, now First Methodist Church. They alternated back and forth between the Presbyterian and Central Methodist churches during 1925, and then they added St. Luke's and the First Baptist Church, which is interesting because most of the people that own the Arlington were members of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, but they didn't show up until 1926. I suspect that the churches paid the cost of their services being aired, and also the cost of the phone lines to connect it. And during the week and on Saturdays, KTHS broadcast from 12:30 until 1:30 with all sorts of things. The Arkansas Department of Education sponsored a Farmers to Chocolate Chautauqua each Friday, and the Bible class and Boys Talk was added in 1926 to the Saturday schedule. And if that's all there was to KTHS, we wouldn't be talking today, but we still have the magic of Skyway. This is another way to look at it. During the day, the blue glare is there, at night it's not, and KTHS signed on just about there when the Skywave was up and stable and ready to transmit its signal across the United States. Here's another way to look at it. And there is the approximate nighttime coverage of KTHS. There was a zone in the middle where it could not be received because the skywave and the ground wave interfere, but you can see this goes from Denver to almost the East Coast, to Canada, to South Florida, all of Texas. Doesn't mean it was audible every night, but it was audible. And on December 20th, 1924, KTHS came on the air. Greetings to Radio Land. Station KTHS in Hot Springs National Park, Arkansas is now on the air. The first program from KTHS was a concert by the Meyer Davis 10-piece orchestra under the direction of Jack Renard. And KTHS received 186 telegrams and 25 long-distance calls from 22 states. Now here's the big star of KTHS. Meyer Davis was a famous band leader. He started in 1920 with his first band. By 1922, he was at the Willard Hotel in Washington and the Astoria Hotel in New York. And then he began to franchise his Meyer Davis orchestras for any sort of venue and event. And in 1924, the Arlington Hotel contracted with the Meyer Davis Orchestra to perform live and on KTHS. Whether Meyer Davis was ever in Hot Springs or not, we don't know, but his orchestra was here. We also had the New Arlington Hotel Orchestra with Lon Chassie as the director. There were also orchestras at the Eastman Hotel and at the Majestic Hotel, and they also performed on KTHS. And one of the mainstays was Lawton Reed with Kimball Theater Organ at the Princess Theater. Now, a theater organ is a specialized organ that was meant to accompany silent movies. It had regular organ keys, but it also had a number of keys that would produce sounds, bang a drum. Some of them could even play a piano. And there were all sound effects for the movies. And there was also a player associated with this. And this is not the original organ. This is it was lost in a fire about 1929. But it was meant to accompany silent movies, and there was a player on here that would play the compositions of famous organists if necessary. Many nights they would go to the Princess Theater for 30 minutes to fill in music with Lawton Reed playing New York. The Ray Mullins Orchestra also appeared on the Como Roof Garden and on KTHS. Now this, in 1920, the first picture is a picture of what is now known as the Mountain Valley Water Building, then known as the DeSoto Springs Building. And you can see that in 1921 or so, they added an upper story. And that upper story was the Japanese ballroom. Now here's a picture courtesy of Clyde Covington of the inside of the ballroom. And you'd think that it probably hasn't lasted, but it actually has. These two pictures courtesy of Harold Higgins were taken week before last. And they have preserved the space. They have no plans to rent it out, but they use it for corporate meetings and get-togethers and things like that. And he said it's in wonderful shape. That big globe in the middle is filled with light bulbs, and there was a picture on the wall of them having to replace them all at one point. But nonetheless, they maintained it, and it looks nice. Now, they also had summer concerts at Whittington Park on KTHS. I can't lend anything to Mr. Ron Thor's excellent presentation from October 20th, 2020, and I asked you all to go look at them. But they had a good time at the Whittington Park band show. Now, they also broadcast a little further afield. This is the 555 gas station, auto station in Little Rock on Broadway. And on the top floor of it, they built the Rainbow Garden. Another photo courtesy of Clyde Covington. This shows the dance floor. It was only available during the winter because it got desperately hot up there during the summer. Now, if you'll notice, there's a chandelier hanging in the middle, and that chandelier was rescued and is now at the Junior League headquarters in Little Rock that they rent out for weddings and various venues like that. You might go down and see it, but this is the best picture that we have. And then we have a wedding. Cam Arnu and Natalie Bingham were married on June 30th, 1925. They had their 2 children in Hot Springs. And that was the KTHS story. KTHS continued until 1928, and it moved from the Arlington to the Hot Springs Country Club and came under the ownership of the Chamber of Commerce. Cam Arnu went on in 1929. He moved to WTAR radio and television. Well, television came along later. As general manager, he became president of the National Association of Broadcasters and was really quite a radio and television career. Natalie lived on, moved to Florida with one of her children, and she died in 1997. Ed Oles left KTHS about the same time that Cam did, but he went to work teaching teaching radio classes. And then he went into the pharmacy business, where he managed pharmacies for some years. And this is what happened to KTHS. Colonel T.H. Barton of Barton Coliseum fame attempted to buy KTHS from the Chamber of Commerce. And Colonel Barton bought KARK in Little Rock when he couldn't buy KTHS. And KARK had superior daytime coverage, so the NBC Radio Red Network, and there were 2 radio networks and 2 NBC networks in those times, the Red Network and the Blue Network. Blue did not have any affiliates in Arkansas. So they shifted from KTHS to KARK, so KTHS became an affiliate of the new CBS radio network. However, the FCC had a new policy that disfavored civic-owned and municipally owned radio stations and made it very convenient for KTHS to be sold. So it was sold to the Kelly family of Shreveport, owners of KTVS. Well, it was expensive to run KTHS, and there was not a lot of business in Hot Springs, advertising business to support it. So the Kelly family wanted to move KTHS from Hot Springs and actually obtained a construction permit to move to West Memphis, Arkansas. And it would have been the most powerful radio station in the United States because the ground connectivity in the Mississippi Valley is just incredible. However, Arkansas did not want to lose the radio station to what would essentially be a Memphis operation. And the governor of Arkansas got involved. I believe it was Carl Bailey at that point, and the construction permit was canceled. Then KTHS moved to Little Rock. They increased power to 50,000 watts and had moved to 1090 by that point. And they built a wonderful transmitter plant. Cecil Sue built this with 3 tall towers at Wrightsville, Arkansas. They also built CBS affiliate KTHV Channel 11. Mr. Sue built that as well. But in 1962, the Kelly family sold KTHS to Lum Broadcasting, who changed the call letters to KAAY, which became the Silver Dollar Sound and Friendly Giant, and kind of introduced rock music to Central Arkansas and actually to Middle America. And this is where KTHS, KAAY got in trouble. They were sold to Multimedia Broadcasting in Greenville, South Carolina. And they sent a series of managers to KAAY that just didn't understand Arkansas. As one manager was quoted, Jim Tandy was his name, they should build a fence around Arkansas so all these crazy people cannot escape. I never met Jim Tandy, and it's just as well. But of course, this didn't, in an advertising environment that's run by ad agencies, the word got around pretty quickly, and KAAY started to really suffer financially. So Multimedia sold KAAY to other broadcast interests who turned it into a religious station. David Treadway was the last contemporary music director of KAAY. And it was sold so many times after I left Multimedia that I really couldn't keep up with it. And years of neglect finally caught up with KAAY, and it all came crashing down. Literally. Oh. I took that picture when I was here in June. That is the west tower, the third tower of KAAY. And it was destroyed by corporate neglect. Now, instead of maintaining the antenna like they should have, and instead of reconstructing it, KAAY asked the FCC to lower its nighttime power from 50,000 watts to 18 watts. Barely be heard in Little Rock at night, and you can't get it in Hot Springs. And other broadcasters will take advantage of KAAY's absence on 1090, and it will never be restored to its former glory. So that's a sad end of KAAY. Thank you. What are your questions?
What was the motivation that didn't want them to broadcast music?
It was a restriction. I don't know what the rationale was, and there was probably opposite. It's hard to say. I don't know, but that was the restriction of a Class B station that was put on by the Department of Commerce. The rationale behind that'd be an interesting thing to know. I don't know, but it was the government. That's what they said you did, so that's what you did. But I don't know what the rationale was. It was also wonderful for folks who performed live. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Was there also a radio station in the Hot Springs at the Army-Navy hospital?
If there was, I'm not aware of it, and it doesn't show up in the record. It may have been a private station that was just meant for the hospital grounds. That was not uncommon. But if there was a commercial license granted for that, I'm not aware of it.
Do you know anything about Dick Willever?
I've heard the name, but no, I don't.
Okay, I'm Cecil Suit's grandson.
Oh, you're done.
Yeah, and so like I've been doing a whole lot of research of, because he actually played tenor and alto sax before all this in high school at the Majestic in the house band, and was traveling to El Dorado, I think, to play before high school, and then he was chief engineer, so he would actually do broadcasts in the tower and then go downstairs into Arlington and play in the house band there.
Yes.
And then go to the Majestic and play other gigs there.
When I say
it's remarkable, I'm trying to.
You're hitting on something that I have not researched yet, is that all these people coming in the house, out of Hot Springs to perform, were all in the trades for that particular, for musicians and things. And I have not gotten to research those things.
It's so bizarre how, like the Willow Room and stuff, I guess they would just sight read this stuff and play with, Liberace, everybody.
What can I tell you? Hot Springs had the best of everything.
It really did. He used to tell this story about almost hitting Liberace with his car because he walked out of the Majestic. For some reason, he was having an argument with his manager or something, but he almost ran Liberace down on Park Avenue one night, going to the gig to play.
Yes.
Oh no.
There are all these stories.
Yeah, it's bizarre.
Anyone else? Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much. And I want to say thank you to you for coming back yet again, and we hope to see more of you. It was a great program, and love the interjection of humor here, there, and the other. With that, I also want to say thank you to the Garland County Library for hosting us and broadcasting. Speaking of radio, it's not radio anymore, and Paul Kagabine, for being our tireless supporter here. And just to remind everybody before somebody grabs me off the stage that, that we are a volunteer organization. We're supported by membership, contributions. So anyone who would like to join, we have membership brochures in the back, or if you're online, to give us a call, come by the Historical Society. We really appreciate it. And with that, I'll adjourn. Thank you so much.